but it's undeniable that people are going to have to get very comfortable with this technology, AI agents, whatever the next kind of version of that is going to be, where it works in the organization. How does that AI infrastructure work? And how do they deploy it both intelligently to work for the workforce, but also to drive value for them as a team? The people who do that, I think, will still stick around as L&D teams. Roll with the punches, because the change is already here. It's changing across there, and it's not going to go back to what you might have done previously. So you just kind of need to figure out, where is your value proposition there now?
This is how we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, Forsaven, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.
Ross, welcome to the show.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
We were just talking before we hit record that I think the last time I was on a show with you was before you became a full-time creator.
Yeah, as they say. Yeah, it's true, right? Time flies.
So give our audience a little summary of it. What's happened since you were an L&D practitioner since you last spoke? What's happened since then?
Yeah, definitely. So the TLDR, or the too long didn't read, for people who don't spend all their time on Reddit, is pretty much that last time we spoke, I was head of L&D at a tech company, which at that point was a unicorn, went to become a PLC, and I'd spent about 4 years there. And then after that, I decided to basically not go out my own completely, did a bit of kind of like, let's call it consulting or strategy work in the industry, and then decided to turn my side project, which is, very fashionable these days, into a full-time thing, which is, for people who don't know, so I have a company called Still These Thoughts, where I basically write a newsletter every week that goes out to a shocking amount of people that terrifies me every time that I press send, that basically talks about L&D technology, maximizing that, leveraging that in the industry, kind of keeping up with industry trends, providing insights, etc., etc. And yeah, I built a business from that. So I write this newsletter. I work with organizations in terms of looking specifically at their technology stacks and how to look, well, not look at, I should say, how to kind of integrate emerging and existing tech and make the most of that, right? Because HR and L&D industries aren't stereotypically very good with technology. So I'm very lucky in that. So I've spent the last 3 years kind of playing around in that space. Obviously, another big movement in terms of AI happened to emerge just as I made that switch. So it's been interesting to kind of be alongside that switch happening, where not so many people ask me the traditional questions anymore that they had been doing for a decade previously. It's very much, and I'm sure you know as well, with companies that you work with, very AI focused. So yeah, that's where I've been kind of playing in the last few years.
So, I mean, with Still These Thoughts, you'd started this even while you had a day job, right? So
I did,
what made you start it while you had a day job?
Honestly, job security was, to be quite honest, like, it's a bit of a different world nowadays, but it started about, I want to say, a decade ago. So I was working for a huge organization at that point, retail org, Tesco. So for those in the UK, they'll be familiar with Tesco, and Europe, maybe not so much if you're in the States and other areas of the world, but they're a huge organization. I had a lot of my education there for kind of 7 years in terms of learning about big business and how things work, etc. But I became very aware of how quickly businesses transform, how quickly you are superstar one day, kind of gone tomorrow. And I was kind of like, okay, I need to have some kind of like calling card thing here, because I don't think a CV is going to crack it. Bearing in mind, this is at a time in like 2015 where newsletters were not sexy at all. Everything of it was about social media. Email was dead. SEO was dead, as we always keep hearing for decades. And it was kind of like no one was writing newsletters. And at this time, I've been doing loads of kind of big projects with Tesco. At that point, I would go to these kind of conferences, and like many people know in the industry, where you kind of behind closed doors kind of communities and dinners and etc. And people were always asking me about, well, how do you do X when you're at this company? How are you doing these projects and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, why don't I just write as much as I can without being sued by my company at that point about how I'm doing things and what's the kind of method behind it. And I just started doing that. I started doing it on LinkedIn. I think I just started writing like 3 things of the week or whatever. And then that eventually emerged into a newsletter that literally went to about 3 people for a month. And then I just spent like the better part of a decade doing it mostly part-time on the train backwards and forwards from London, to be quite honest, at crazy times of night. And then I'm kind of here now pretty much. So yeah, definitely not an overnight success story as people like to hear, but it's been a kind of whole decade just doing it mostly, never getting paid, never really getting kind of huge exposure. And then I suppose more of that happened over the last, let's say, 4 years. So that, yeah, that's what it really came from, was kind of job security. But also, you know, saying as myself as an L&D practitioner, I just wanted to learn how that world worked. Like, how were people doing these things at this point, you know, 2015, where the creator economy had already existed, but it was really starting to build up. You know, you were seeing people on YouTube and Twitter at that point that were building their own one-person businesses. And I was just really interested from a learning standpoint, like, how does that work? How do you run a newsletter? How do you make all these things happen? How do you do promotion? How do you build all this kind of thing? Like, how do you make this work? So it was never supposed to be like a business. It was just a side learning project. Like, all right, I'll kill it when I'm too busy and I haven't got time. And thankfully I didn't do that. And I am where I am.
Before I hit you with the hard question, Ross, I'm curious to understand, you know, a lot of people, they'll send out those first few newsletters, and when they've only got 3 people reading it, you know, quite often you're like, oh, you know what, it's only 3 people, it's not growing. You get disheartened and you just stop doing it, right? It takes some level of, I guess, resilience to be consistent, and also a lot of discipline to be able to do this. But what kept you going, given it is a bit of a flywheel, right? It takes a while for it to get going before you become that overnight success. What kept you doing it?
It does. I think that's the key thing to say, right? Is that people really, they underestimate what they can do in a year, but really overestimate what they can do in a week or two. Like, everyone thinks, like, you know, they don't hit big on whatever social media platform now or make a certain amount of sales, that's it. It's kind of dead in the water. So it's like you say, there's that whole resilience thing. But the thing for me is just like, it's just showing up. It just became a habit. It was just like, you know, I still remember now, like, I have a full-time job during the week. Every Sunday morning, I would say, I'm taking 4 or 5 hours and I'm going to do this thing. And it became like very much like my own kind of gym routine. It just became a form of discipline. So it came a form of, you know, sometimes the newsletters were great. Sometimes, to be quite honest, they sucked. Other times they were kind of middle of the road, right? That just is what it is. But it was the habit of just keep turning up and doing it. And it was really for myself. I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I was just like, I'm really interested in getting better at this skill of kind of communicating and writing and understanding how these systems work. So I'm just going to keep doing it and see what happens. And if nothing happens from it, even if I do it for a year or two, at least I've learned something from that. And that's all it was, really. So it was just like, and there's probably part ego in there as well, right? You just kind of want to keep going and see what happens. And like, can you do this thing? Like, you get to 10 people, then 100 people, and 500 people. And like, oh, okay, can I keep? How long can this go on for until it just kind of collapses? But yeah, it's just showing up. And to be quite honest, there is no formula for that. You know, you just have to keep going. And you may spend years doing that before there's any real viable feedback where things start coming in. But then they do, right? It was when people started DMing me and they were like, oh, I read your thing and this is really great. And like, people are, you know, definitely in the last 5 years where like people are huge organizations where they've got incredibly smart people, and I'm just like, why are you talking to me? Like, why are you messaging me? Like, this is just a weird thing happening here. So when those bits happen, you see the fruits of your labor. But yeah, a lot of it is, you know, as you say as well, a lot of it is resilience, and it's just showing up. If you don't show up and give it a go, you know, you're not going to know. You're just going to sit there and wonder. If it doesn't work out, fine, you know, kill it and then move on and maybe try something else. But if you don't do it and you'll sit there and just say, oh, I wonder if I kept doing that, then what would have happened? Well, that's it really at the end of the day.
You know, Ross, it reminds me of in the early days when we were starting up, like I'd listen to every podcast, read every blog, go to every event, hoping someone's going to share like the secret sauce of how do you build this big successful business. And whenever you listen to people who've been there, done that, they're always turning up saying, oh, it's focus, oh, it's perseverance. And you're like, cut this boring stuff out. Tell me the secret sauce. And then you get to a certain point where you realize, it is just doing those boring things consistently is actually really
100%.
hard.
It's time.
So that is the secret formula, right? It is, you gotta, the moment you realize the boring stuff isn't the boring stuff, and you probably got to stick with doing that, it makes the difference. All right, let's hit you with the questions that everyone wants to hear you answer. Right, so I'm going to take you back to, do you remember Clubhouse?
Yeah, God, that was a moment, wasn't it?
Right? Yeah. Exactly what I was going to say. It was a moment. I remember when like Clubhouse came on the scene, and I saw L&D folk in particular were jumping on this, and they were whiffing on, this is the new paradigm. It's all about audio first right now. And I did a course, like I did a live session like this. I did that. I did this. And there's so much extrapolation of what this could be. That lasted for all of about a few weeks, and then it just died a very quick death. And I think that's one example. There are many examples like that. And quite often people find it hard to kind of differentiate between, what is an actual trend versus what's a trend. So is AI, what is it? Is it a real trend, or is it like a trend? Or is this going to pass by? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of layers to that, right? I think where this AI thing gets a bit confused is, and you'll know this as well, being in the tech business, right, is that AI has been around for a bloody long time, like 40, 50 years, right, in the background, doing its thing, helping people live and work, and they're not even knowing about it. Operates traffic lights, you've got autonomous cars, you've got things going on for predictive AI analytics, all of that happening across your tools. You just don't know about it. Everyone evidently has become, and rightly so, super excited, because part of that AI family and generative AI was kind of the first thing we could all use. And everyone was like, oh my God, holy crap, like this can actually do things for us and I can interact with it. So I don't think it's like a trend. I think the actual technology itself definitely has staying power, definitely has capabilities, and evidently is part of our world now and will be going forward. I think, of course, when people talk about from stock and investment standpoint in terms of AI bubbles, I think, yes, there is some form of a bubble in there somewhere. And I think it's trying to differentiate at the moment, like what that actually is. I think a lot of it you can probably point to currently is maybe the overhyping of a lot of the kind of automated capabilities. And what I mean by that is that generative AI being able to do all of these things on their own, instead of basically saying, how is it an extension of a human being or human conscious, human intelligence to do stuff? So yeah, it's multi-layered for me, because I think the technology evidently is sound. There's a lot of benefit to it. There's a lot of application. There's a lot of stuff that can be used. I just think at the moment in time, a lot of the conversational noise, shall we call it, around its actual application, and those applications providing ROI, whether that is in an investment standpoint or impact standpoint, has still, rightly so, got a kind of question mark over it. Because, yes, there are reports in all industries that have kind of come out and said, here's some case studies, but they're not kind of like so polarizing where you're like, yeah, I'm going to put all my chips on this, and this is going to be definitely the thing for it. So yeah, it's hard to answer. Like I say, it is multi-layered. Tech is sound. I think, like all things, like all innovations that come out at the beginning, we all have to look back to kind of dot-com eras and stuff, and the birth of the internet and other bits in that. You had loads of companies, you had loads of solutions. Then there was this kind of great culling, and then we got down to the Amazons, the Googles, the ones that remained from that. And I think that's going to come at some point. It's just the task of a lot of us at the moment to kind of figure out what's the noise and how do we cut through that, and how do we actually say, yes, this is good, and here's actually how we use it, and getting away from, a lot of the gimmicky stuff that I'm sure everyone listening to this sees on X nowadays, or LinkedIn, where it feels like every other day someone's like, this has killed this, and this does that, and this ends here, and that's died because of that. I think that is the part at the moment where a lot of that is a trend. That trend of seeing those same posts on LinkedIn of, like I say, this kills this, that's dead, this is over, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's the trend. The technology, not so.
So with AI, do we still need L&D?
I don't know, honestly. That's my honest opinion. But I'd say that even before AI, to be fair, I don't think this is a new, I won't call it a crisis, the wrong thing to say, because I mean, you'll know this as well from the space that you're working in, where people have always asked the question in terms of, do we still need L&D if people are using Google or people are using learning technology on their own? What role do those humans in the L&D department play in that organization? And the relevance of those people depends on the organization, its culture, and what they do. In some organizations, L&D is very much ingrained and they have been partners in the organization. They have been more performance based. Many other organizations that we all know, maybe even people that listen, they're more like, what do I hate to say it half the time, they're more like McDonald's drive-throughs or Amazon delivery services. They're kind of just that thing at the side that just appears when someone says, I'm going to click this button and I expect this to happen, and that's it. So even before all of kind of AI now, I think that question and thought process is still there. I just think because of AI and the potential and the promise that people talk about, I think there's a lot more scrutinizing in saying, well, is that function needed? But the other side of that is also, do businesses actually understand what that function does and how it drives value? And do the people in that function even understand how they drive value? Or have they become so reliant on, because learning tech being so big the last 2 decades, have they become so reliant on technology that actually that department for some organizations doesn't really do anything but manage technology now? They don't really interface with stakeholders or have human conversations. So yeah, it's a hard one, right? I think it's all contextual, because there's going to be some companies, and we've seen this in the online world, right, where they're talking about their merging departments, and that may make sense to them, right? And there's other companies where it might not make sense. So it's all very contextual. So if it stays as it is, I don't know. That depends, right? But I think there's opportunity for the function in itself to evolve with the technology that's available now, and maybe provide value in different ways where that technology can't, right? Because Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, that some people might know as ChatGPT's creator, has been saying some very interesting things recently in how he believes, because of basically technology that his company is creating and making so much changes, that human experiences and human interaction and human curated and creative stuff will be a lot more of a premium. So I think it's interesting that not just N&D departments, but I think other departments as well, to then look at, well, how do they leverage that human side of what they do? Because if the tech is getting so good now, it can fundamentally run a lot of the stuff that was happening before. Then there needs to be kind of a shift to say, well, what do we now offer in that place? Whether you call it L&D, whatever it is, I don't know. There'll still be a learning component. There'll still be a sharing component, but maybe it won't be what we look at today as kind of that traditional L&D department.
So what do you think they will be doing? Like, given already what we can see generative AI is capable of doing, and you can probably take a fair assumption and extrapolate what it will be able to do. And, from a designing learning experiences to some extent, it's able to collect feedback data, it's able to ideate, develop something, then deliver it back to you almost instantly. I can engage with it and tailor it to exactly what I want. And so already it's probably doing a lot more than what many L&D functions might be doing in their organization today.
Yeah.
In that world, what should the L&D function be doing?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? If they're smart about it, they'll invest the time in understanding the technology and looking at how can they use it to, yes, automate some of the stuff that stops them from doing more of the human tasks and more of the human interaction, but also then looking at, well, how do we amplify what we already do in the team, from a task perspective, and understand how can we improve that? Because, we can't deny in some sectors that if you are mediocre or a mediocre L&D person, it's going to be hard for you, right? Because a lot of these tools can do a lot of that stuff at that level and even better in some regards. So it forces people to up their game in that respect. But what it also forces teams to do, which they may not like as an industry, is to get closer to understanding how does technology work and how do we become kind of like leaders in that? So I'm sure some people have seen the Microsoft reports where they've basically been talking about they see more people effectively being leaders of AI agents, which is probably going to be the case, right? We're probably all going to need to get comfortable with understanding what are agents, how do they work, how do we build them, when do we deploy them, what do they do? That's going to be a big seismic shift, and people will be responsible not just for humans, but also for those AI agents as well and how they work and what they provide on there. And that will be a huge shift, right, from all standpoints. Probably more from when you talk about experience design, for sure. I think that will have to change in terms of what happens today and what kind of experiences people seek. But the other side of that is that I think what we'll see and what I see with companies that I work with at the moment is that there's still that growing human bit, which is really interesting because L&D has always been about talking about the classroom and then hating the classroom and not doing classroom training anymore. But because now so much tech and so much less human interaction, what I'm now starting to see is demand for people going, well, I'll actually like to spend a bit more time with humans because I spend so much time with this AI coach doing this, or I spend so much time getting Claude or ChatGPT to tutor me on this kind of subject that actually I'd kind of like a space to go and do that. So I still think that is going to be there, but just very, very different. It won't be that stereotypical thing we all know. It really has to be kind of a premium experience and make sense on there. But it's undeniable that people are going to have to get very comfortable with this technology, AI agents, whatever the next kind of version of that is going to be, where it works in the organization. You interact with it as a user, you interact with it as a participant as well, and then understanding how do experiences get designed in that, because evidently very quickly we've gone from conversations via text to voice to avatars seeing us, looking at us, hearing us, understanding body mannerisms. So people are going to expect those experiences. So you'll need to meet that level and then understand where do the human things come into that as well. And the reason why I say that is because when we talked before about L&D's role in the team is that we still have to consider that there's going to be elements of what we can kind of look at as skill erosion, or particular skills and human skills in particular not actually being set as a baseline, because we will rely on this technology like a lot of us are doing, right? You've only got to look at every time a new iteration of ChatGPT or Claude or something comes out, people on Reddit are having a meltdown because it was their best friend or something and it doesn't talk to them the way it talks to them before. Like, people are forming these emotional attachments and these experiences to it. So from an L&D standpoint, just shoving out a course now is not going to be the same when someone goes, well, why wouldn't I just go and talk to ChatGPT, who will contextualize that and guide me through it as I am now? So the customer experience, if you want to call it, has changed. So it's really about, when we talk about relevance, is will those teams meet that? If they do meet that, the way they're going to have to do that is in understanding how does that AI infrastructure work and how do they deploy it both intelligently to work for the workforce, but also to drive value for them as a team. The people who do that, I think, will still stick around as L&D teams. Evidently, the people who don't do that will struggle, because this is not going to be like you're going to wake up next week and this technology is all going to disappear and no one's going to be using it. People are using it. They want to use more of it. Like I say, the caveat being, we're not really sure yet how big the ROI is, but we definitely know there is efficiencies, there is performance gain there as well. So, don't try and fight it, understand it, utilize it, deploy it. And as I say, experiment and try and, in your own culture and context of your organization, figure out how it works for you. It's very easy for people like me and others who are in the industry who are doing this stuff to say, do this or do that. But it might not work for your organization because you're in a very specific context. So it's very easy to kind of come out with kind of blanket statements. But yeah, I'd very much focus on that. It's here, get used to it, understand how to deploy it from there, and roll with the punches, because the change is already here. It's changing across there, and it's not going to go back to what you might have done previously. So you just kind of need to figure out where is your value proposition there now.
How do you get comfortable, Russ? Like, I mean, looking at you, obviously coming from your career in L&D, evidently you're very comfortable with tech to be able to, now you're tinkering, you're evaluating tech and sharing expertise and knowledge around that. For someone listening to this going, and quite often I hear this when I speak to L&D professionals who are like, just who are not comfortable with tech, right? It's not their bag. And so when you're saying get comfortable, what can I be doing? I'm listening to this now. What can I be doing to get more comfortable, to start understanding the principles of how these things work?
Yeah, I think it's just the basics, really. I think it's unfortunate if people have heard me speak on things before, it's probably sounding like a broken record because it's really no different to when, companies like yourselves are working with organizations and then talking about how to deeply understand the software that they've got in front of them and all the intricacies of it, the features, and how to make the most of that. And my experience has been when I've been working with, vendors, they very much want to help you with that, but it's usually the company that holds them back because the company will just be wanting to use 5% of something and not really understanding the 95%, which is great across the product. And they never knew, even though they had the product for years. But it's all really to do with that internal culture of the team and the business who, unless, they actually need it and there's some kind of pressure on them, they don't do it. So I think the first things first, just like that example with understanding how do the tools that you've already got work is, get the fundamentals. Now, this is not me saying you need to be an expert, but just be savvy. Like we live in a digital world. Most of us spend our lives online. Most people have a general understanding of how social media works. I hope anyway, algorithms all the time on YouTube and LinkedIn that everyone's moaning about consistently. So understanding the systems that you're playing in or the systems that you're working in as well is incredibly important. So I think first things first, and it's not huge, right? Just go away and understand when we talk about generative AI, what does that actually mean? And how do some of those very basic things work? Like when you're using a large language model, like a Microsoft Copilot or a Claude or a Chat GPT, pick your poison pretty much. How does that thing work? How does it give you answers? Where is it getting information from? How does it do that? Understanding those basics that you can do in like 15 minutes to half hour will greatly set you up to understand, okay, well, when do I use this technology? Where do I use it? And to what effect can it help in that process? I find people who have that understanding will go a lot farther because they're more clued up on the what, the why, and how, and can deploy it smartly versus someone who doesn't really understand any of that. They're probably either A, not using it, B, overusing it, or C, only using it to a little bit of its potential. So go away, get those fundamentals on. What are the basics that I need to know? And then spend that time then going to experiment and look at, well, based on your context, whether it's work, whether it's personal life, where are some areas that I can invite this in and play around with it? Evidently, the work context is a little bit different because you need to have approved tools and all that kind of stuff from a disclaimer standpoint. From a personal point, you can go on and just play around with a few of these things to understand, well, how can I do basic Q&A, information retrieval, documentation summarization? Maybe I'll use a deep research model to go off and do a big bit of research for me. If, as an example, you're going to go do a trip to Japan, you want to go around all these different areas. There's so many opportunities to use that and just understand how does that work from that standpoint. And that gives you a view of its potential opportunities, but also limitations as well, because you start to understand that it's not a silver bullet, but actually it's really good for some stuff. So the main thing will be just spend time on the fundamentals. And, YouTube is obviously a massive treasure trove for that. There are loads of companies, your Googles, your Microsofts that have got free kind of education to do that. Again, go and find the places and the people that kind of resonate with you to do that. But I guarantee, spending that half hour to an hour just getting clear on the basics will help you both personally and professionally in navigating this kind of next technological innovation.
Where do you think AI's limits are for helping humans learn us? Because we hear a lot of, like you say, you go on LinkedIn, it's constantly AI will do everything and anything. And I don't think we almost talk as much about where the kind of risks and concerns. And whenever you do hear anyone talking about risks and concerns, it's always the kind of extreme doomsday scenario rather than the in-between of where the limitations are. Where do you think the limitations are?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a learning perspective, obviously some of this also kind of bleeds into the kind of bigger perspective as well. But, the biggest elephant in the room is always the hallucinations of these tools, which look, it's a feature, it's not a bug. We have to learn to live with that. That's also why as humans, we still need to deploy skills to be a bit more skeptical and be like, okay, that doesn't sound quite right. Fact checking that because, regardless of these tools continue to get better and better, there's still cases where I have interactions. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't sound right. I was alive at that point. That definitely doesn't sound right. I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. So that's the kind of big thing. I think for learning in particular, and it's still the fact that what we can't replace is experience and context. And I think for 95% of people that use these tools, they don't spend the time providing context or understanding how much context do these tools have on my particular situation, where I am as an individual, to actually help me. And that kind of gets people into trouble from a learning experience standpoint, because they're relying on those tools to know inherently and deeply their context in those situations. And that sometimes doesn't work out very well, unless, of course, they've built a tool themselves, they've worked with a company deeply to do that. That's a kind of different perspective there. But it's also the element of experience. And I'll give you an example of this, because I was reading an article the other day where it was basically talking about doctors getting calls from family members of patients who had basically taken test results that people get in hospital, put them into ChatGPT or whatever large language model, and then basically that model has said, oh, this person has got this failure or this disease or whatever. And then they'd phone up the hospital, have a go at the doctor and say, how come you haven't told me my wife has got kidney failure or whatever? And they didn't have that at all. And what was missing there is, in that perspective, is that the experience of the doctor and the context of the situation in understanding that little bit of data that ChatGPT picked up, looked at a generalization of that information, and then gave that individual a probable answer based on that general information, but then it caused trouble. So and this keeps happening. This is kind of a big thing that's happened at the moment, especially across the Europe and US at the moment in time. But you can also see this from a learning perspective as well. I really like the ideas of, whatever you want to call them, kind of AI tutors and AI coaches. I think they can work really well if they're given the kind of context and the time to build upon there. But I think what you still can't replace is saying that someone with experience, who's got the war stories, that's got the scars, 15, 20 years of that, they can still be part of that process. It's not an either or. And I think my problem at the moment is I see a lot of these things where people are like, AI first schools or AI first this only. I think that's a difficult road to go down, because then you're pushing out that element of experience where, yes, it's great to use this stuff from a learning perspective, but it's even better to use that tutor or coach and then talk to someone who's got 20 odd years experience to actually contextualize that and say, how does that work in principle? Because what AI is really good at is giving us an answer and putting together resources and giving us that generalization. It can still help with personalization if we give it, of course, but it's not so good at saying, I've actually done this for 20 years and I've been through the navigation of that, and then kind of helping you to kind of make it make sense in what you're doing. So I think, yeah, from the learning perspective, there's definitely that. But I think that will always improve. I don't know how. Obviously, I'm not in the machine learning world or the AI world to do that, to build it. But I think if we look at the pace of innovation, I can't help but think, yeah, they'll probably solve some of that stuff. But I think at the moment in time, it's interesting because I'm sure you have as well. ChatGPT's got study mode, Google's got Learn with Me, Claude's got the same thing. They're great and they're interesting as a base level. Well, I'm not going to sit there and probably delve into real deep topics. But then again, those companies aren't saying they're built for that, really. They're kind of saying, look, for really foundational stuff where we can get you going and help you out, then, we can do that. What they're not saying is we're going to sit there and teach you quantum physics and go through all of that stuff. So, again, it's a balancing act, but I think those are the things to watch out for sure, is not to fully look at this as a replacement for everything. Look at it as part of that ecosystem of, tools and solutions that you use.
100%. I think it's that risk of it's almost replacing where courses were the answer to everything, and whatever need was in the business, you'd create a course. It's almost like we're trying to replace that with something else, rather than appreciating the fact that, like you said, there are multiple tools in the toolbox, and you pick what you want to use. Because we find, we have Guru, which is the kind of AI tutor coach that we've developed and put out there. But what we still find is, for the 0 to 1 learning in a particular topic, And actually, that structured path or course is still better fit, because actually, to get from 0 to 1, you're all probably following the same journey, right? There's nothing to adapt to you yet, because you don't know enough about the topic. And I think that's why it's quite unsurprising that even when the likes of OpenAI put out their own educational material, it still follows a course, because when you're learning something brand new, and that 0 to 1 is better structured to understand the core foundation. But it's once you've got that foundational knowledge, now when you're building on top of that, and you're kind of incrementally learning more about it, and you're trying to specialize, that's where I think like an AI tutor can really bring to life the application of a particular skill, as well as kind of adapting the journey. And then completely agree about, we're also betting big on the idea of community, because there's a lot of stuff where, like you said, experience is one thing. Another thing is organizations are notoriously bad at capturing knowledge. So I think most organizations underappreciate how much good stuff lives in the brains of the people in their organization. And the reality is, you can only feed AI what you've got captured somewhere, right? And if you've not got that captured, then all of that good stuff isn't there. And the only way you can still benefit from it is really that community, or facilitating that human to human interaction. What do you think L&D are getting wrong about AI? Like, what's the most common things you're seeing where they're getting this wrong about AI again?
Yeah, I think it's probably still the same thing really from 2-3 years ago. I think it's kind of the content game, right? And what I mean by that is that kind of content creation bit. But I don't think that's any different if you look at, even we were talking about the creative space earlier on, we look at the marketing space, we look at the sales space. I think people are looking at very much low hanging fruit. It's like, how do we just do the thing we're already doing faster and cheaper? And I think that feels good in the moment and at the time. But essentially, all you're doing is keeping the same model. Whereas fundamentally, what we're looking at here is a technology that is going to rewire that model. And if we look at a lot of the companies that are fundamentally taking that out of education and workplace L&D's hands, which the big AI and tech companies are, and saying, this is how you'll learn going forward, and this is what you'll experience. I think that's a big problem if people just keep going out and saying, and it's quite funny, I have this all the time. It doesn't matter how many companies I speak to or how many places I speak at, people aren't really asking deep questions around how do we rewire what we do because we have new technology to help us do that, or you can say reshape it. They're asking me things like, oh, I've got 100 courses to do this year. How do I get AI to write all those and push it out? Or what's the best tool for giving me a PowerPoint presentation? People are very much thinking too small and too finite, and actually not looking at, well, what more can I do that I couldn't do previously? How do I extend my capabilities and do the things that weren't possible? So, and it's quite prevalent, right? I still, there's obviously loads of reports and things online, you see stuff and that, but I think that is like the 0.001%. Like a lot of the teams that I work with, a lot of people that I speak to, it is that same thing. It's like, how do we make content faster? How do we make content cheaper? I understand that. We're not going to get away from that for a while, because the industry is built on content libraries and it's built on content delivery. So you're not going to turn that tap off overnight. And I say to companies all the time, you're not going to go from, your kind of trusted LMS and LXP today, and then tomorrow switch that all off and put an AI coach on. It's just not going to happen. Like, we're all familiar with that setup. We understand that infrastructure. It's familiar, it's safe. It will take time to get to those spaces where people are more comfortable with that. So yeah, I don't think that the content thing is that big thing I keep seeing. What I'd rather see people do is actually think about, well, what's the opportunity for me to reshape, or as a team to reshape what we're able to provide from a solution standpoint, because we now have access to something like a chat GPT or an AI coach or a tutoring system. How do we change what we do versus just keep doing it, right? Because I don't think in the long run, those teams will survive, because it will get to a point where people just go, well, I'm not even going to look at the content anymore because it's in this system, or people get smart enough, or they have an AI that's smart enough that says, here's how to create an API that pushes that over to here, and then I would just have it there. So I think, yeah, that's the thing for me. I'm not surprised, but like I say, 2-3, it's still the same thing. People are like, how do I create a presentation? How do I create content faster? I just don't think that's the way, really.
Yeah, it reminds me of, like, I know a lot of people who the first time they used ChatGPT was when you could do the image generation, right? And they went and, did what the rest of the world did, which is to create those kind of Studio Ghibli style images. And I think that particular story probably captures the problem, which is you went to a tool that could do a million different incredible things, yet you chose to create a Studio Ghibli version of a photo of yourself.
Yeah.
And it's probably quite telling, right? It's not necessarily about the access and availability of this incredible technology. It's having the imagination, the motivation, to the desire, all of those things, the creativity to want to do something with it. And so I think it's only half the battle that this tech gets accessible and people buy this stuff. But what they do with it, someone's going to create courses with it, and that's what they're going to do for the next few years. That's what we're going to get out of it.
Yeah, 100%, isn't it? It's like, look, most people have a smartphone. They're like, what, $1,000? They're super powerful. 90% of people look at that and go, I use that to text people and look online. Someone else looks at it and goes, I'm going to build a $5 million creator business using this phone only and doing that. It is all about intent and what people are going to do with that. And again, it takes time. We spoke about the kind of creator economy at the beginning, which is still pretty young, but it's maybe like 15, 20 years in now. I think in this game of generative AI, this is like year 4 at the moment, and the innovation has been so fast is that you can't really take a breath to say, let me go and check out that feature, because that feature then becomes 100 times different by next month, and you're trying to figure out, crap, I didn't even know what that was, and now here that's there. And by the time you get to that, something else comes along, and it's just like boom, 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 boom. So yeah, I get that is hard, right? But
how do you, well, like, given that, and especially given what you're doing now, you're constantly following what's happening out in tech and all the changes. And I know, being in tech myself, sometimes it's like, bloody hell, it's like it's even too much for us being in tech, right? Like, I can completely understand how people get fatigued by constantly getting hit with, now there's this new thing, and now there's there's like 100 new product releases that have come out from all of these companies. How do you not get like just numb from just getting hit with this news, and just at some point just switching off, going, you know what, I'm just gonna bury my head in the sand because it's just all too much?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think the main thing I do is probably how I approach my business in life in general, where I just niche down to what's in my arena. Like, when you were talking about the Studio Ghibli images or whatever, and there was another trend as well where people were making themselves into like toys in toy packages or whatever. Like, none of that serves any relevance for me. It's funny. Like, we see the videos that are coming out now, like, Sora 2 and all this other stuff and that, but it doesn't actually serve a purpose in my world. So for the most part, I'm aware of it, but I don't pay any more attention to it at that. I just kind of see it in the headlines. But what I do is niche down and say, right, okay, so for me, in the industry I work in, I pay more attention to the stuff that appears in that field. So, features of companies like yourself and other companies, when Google does something like Learn LM or their other learning models, I'm interested in that. When ChatGPT do that, I'll look more deeply at that because it serves the work that I am doing and what I'm writing about and what I'm showcasing to companies. Looking at creating cat pictures or creating some videos of animals that go viral on TikTok doesn't serve me any purpose. So I'm not going to look at that, much like where, every other day someone tries to sell me some kind of solution to either A, write my newsletter, which is not going to happen, or B, create endless boring LinkedIn posts for me using AI. I'm not interested in it. So much like we're saying, cut through the noise, my cutting through the noise is basically just saying, this is my niche. I follow the, whatever you want to call it, the trend analysis, the trend reports in that niche. Everything else, not that I don't bother, I just don't give it a lot of attention. If it's something that I find of interest, maybe I'll look at it. But 8 times out of 10, I'm not going to do that because you can't keep up with it. I can't keep up with it. So it's why I just kind of really zero down on, here are the key things that I'm looking for that provide me benefit, that give me value. So I'll focus on those things, unless it's something so crazy that it comes left field and it's going to change the whole world, then I'll look at it. But for the most part, I'm not, every time someone comes on LinkedIn and says, this thing's got released and it's going to kill that, I don't pay attention to it because it's it's every 5 minutes that's going on. And I pay attention to the things where they're in my field, they're in my world of work, and they actually have tangible value. And I think right now in the world, I think we've lost that sense of both common sense and tangible value in terms of saying, oh, that's got tangible value, so I'll actually go and use that, instead of going, here's a new image generator or here's a new video generator, which for me doesn't really serve me in terms of what I'm doing. So I'm not going to jump down the rabbit hole of strange pictures and videos and whatnot where it doesn't do anything.
Last one for you, Russ. I'd love to continue this. There's so much more to talk about. I'm going to get you back on, but just before I leave you, I've got to this point in the episode and I want to know, what's that one thing I should start doing today, Russ? I'm an L&D person. Listen to this. I've been inspired listening to Russ. What's that one thing I should start doing today?
I think just go and experiment. And look, right, I appreciate everyone's going to be at different levels. There's probably people listening who may be a lot more farther in the journey, although I find that rare, to be fair, a lot of people. But there's probably a lot of people who are just wanting to do more, explore. And I always say to people, I'm not an expert at all. Look, I'm not in machine learning. I'm not working in back-end AI or whatever. I'm just an explorer. That's how I see myself. I'm exploring this stuff and I'm trying out this stuff. And I would say just do the same thing, because there is not one person that has the answers. It doesn't matter what conference you go to, what report is. There is no one person that's going to say to you definitively, this is how to use it, and these are the benefits of that. You can look at signs, you can look at signals, you can give advice, but in the reality, what it comes down to is actually going off and playing with that. Whether you use a free tool, whether you're using something at work, you are not going to know until you get involved in it and actually see for yourself, what can this do? What I mean by that is, don't just go off and use it to spell check or write an email for you or do something basic. Actually go there and maybe have a discussion as a thought partner and throw in some ideas, get it to kind of poke holes in that thesis, play devil's advocate, actually do something different and see what it comes back with, and, make your own judgment instead of reading the things on LinkedIn where everyone's hyping up or getting something every other day. So I think that's the biggest thing you can do, both from your work, but also I'd say future-proofing your career, because a lot of companies, right, they want people who understand this stuff, who have played with this stuff. So unfortunately, whether we like it or not, it's really difficult to not get involved and not do it. So yeah, very simply, go and explore and play and see where that takes you.
Go tinker, be the chief tinker officer in your organization. Ross, absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
This is how we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, Forsaven, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.